Ever since Jeff found out his wife Mary was pregnant, he's been working on turning the basement into a men's space. For the first few weeks everything went well, but the situation quickly changed. The noises she heard made a million things go through her head, but she never expected to find what she did. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like and share this video with your friends. One day, as Jeff was getting rid of the old tiles, he heard a strange sound echoing through the basement. He stopped what he was doing and listened, thinking he had imagined something. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, but when he was about to return to his work, he heard the sound again. Jeff was startled by a sound coming from his usually quiet basement, so he got up and started looking around to see where it was coming from. In the basement, there was still a lot of rubble and old furniture, so it could come from anywhere. The search would be long, but he couldn't leave whatever it was. Jeff spent 2 full days searching the basement, finding nothing. It was as if the sound came out of nowhere and disappeared in the same direction. Jeff was a little scared because he was afraid of ghosts in basements, and the sound was starting to rekindle these thoughts. When it was time to go down to the basement the next morning, Jeff had to convince himself that there were no ghosts in his basement before he could go downstairs. Jeff wasn't usually one to be scared that easily, but the lingering sounds from the day before really alarmed him, and his thoughts about supernatural entities didn't help the situation. As soon as Jeff entered the basement, his ears were assaulted by the sound. A chill ran down her spine as she thought about what might be causing it. But Jeff suppressed the thoughts and convinced himself that there must be a logical explanation for what was happening. However, the constant buzzing made no sense. Jeff searched the room several times, but the more he searched, the more the rumors seemed to get worse. It was as if the sound had been imprinted on his mind and he could no longer get rid of it. The hum became so loud that, for a moment, Jeff thought he had gone crazy. The situation went on for months, and Jeff eventually decided to ignore the basement entirely. But one day his wife asked him what was going on, and when he told her it seemed that she didn't believe him. This really hurt his ego and forced him to continue his work there. But before he could do that, he needed someone to confirm that he was still sane. So he asked Mary to go down to the basement to check. Mary was pregnant and had no interest in walking down a flight of stairs to a dark and eerie room. But she wanted her husband to finish his men's room, so she agreed. Mary stayed in the basement for about half an hour, and when she came back she was very frustrated. She hadn't heard anything and didn't understand why her husband behaved the way he did. Since Mary hadn't checked anything, Jeff felt compelled to complete the job he'd started. He decided to go back to the basement and start it again. But every time Jeff was down there, he kept hearing the sound. Every day the sound appeared at least once, and on other days the buzz was persistent. Jeff tried to ignore it, but one day he had enough. The sound had already scared Jeff, and after days of listening, he was determined to find answers. He sat down and listed all the possible causes. As he did so, one thing seemed to stand out from all the rest. The most plausible thing Jeff could find was that there was a wasp nest somewhere in the basement, and since it still had only one light, you wouldn't be able to see it. Convinced that he had found the answer, Jeff headed to the department store. He had planned to install the lights when most of the work was completed, but this was a time like any other. He chose plans for 2 main lights and bought some small recessed lights to add an extra touch and help him capture the pesky creatures that made his life hell. After installing all the lights, Jeff looked around the room and was surprised to find that there were no wasps. He had redone the roof to accommodate lights, added an extra layer of insulation, and covered the old brick wall with slides that housed a new design. But in none of these areas was there a nest or wasp. By then, Jeff had run out of options and was convinced his mind was playing tricks on him. There was no evidence to suggest the sound actually existed, and since his wife couldn't hear it, it must have meant it wasn't there. But Jeff would soon discover that he was by no means a figment of his imagination. After months of hard work, Jeff's basement was finally finished, and he invited some friends over to watch the game to celebrate. Everyone was having fun when Jeff heard the buzz again. But the strange thing was that all his friends felt it too. When the sound came, everyone fell silent. They were silent until the hum was repeated, and they all burst out laughing. The band asked Jeff what the sound was doing, and he admitted he had no idea. His friends saw it as an opportunity and immediately began listing anything that could make buzz. Some were really funny, while others were creepier than Jeff would have liked. "A masseur," Mark yelled. "No, I told you it's the spirit of a man who died when he had his room in this basement. He's probably just looking for some fun," Anthony replied. Although Jeff found the antics amusing, he couldn't help but doubt the thoughts he'd been having for the past few months. His friends had just shown that he wasn't imagining the buzz. So what was the cause? Jeff looked at his friends with all seriousness and told them everything that had happened since he started building the room. They seemed intrigued, and for the first time Jeff felt that someone was taking him seriously. The boys have always loved adventures, and this was one they couldn't turn down, so they agreed to help Jeff solve his problem. The 6 friends got up and each chose a side of the room. They then began to investigate, and by the time they were done, they had practically dismantled the place. The sofa cushions were scattered on the floor. The photo frames were unbalanced and all the alcohol was standing on the counter. There was only one problem. They couldn't find the source of the sound. They searched every corner of the basement, but came up empty, just as Jeff had done every time he'd searched this place. Disappointed, the boys cleaned up and went back to playing. But each of them was still thinking about their own adventure and what could be the possible cause. Until Anthony spoke. "Got it," he yelled. It was a very clever prank orchestrated by Jeff to get us to work together. The rest of the boys considered it a plausible explanation and congratulated Jeff for convincing them to participate. But Jeff knew the truth, and there was no game behind it. Unfortunately, he was left alone again to figure it out. After a few weeks, Jeff was settling into the new space he had created in the basement. But one day after a meeting, he noticed that the buzzing had stopped. He hadn't heard a sound since his friends arrived. It was a relief to have some peace and quiet. But it wouldn't last long. Now that the noise was gone, Jeff was able to fully immerse himself in the men's room experience as it should have been, and before long, he was completely oblivious to the hum that had plagued him for months.